There's probably a lot you don't know about fallout. The atmosphere and vibe of the world before the nuclear apocalypse is the darkest thing I've ever covered. The most eerie scenario I've ever even heard of. The fallout world starts splitting from our timeline around the 1950s. Technology kept moving forward, but culturally, the world just stayed there. Everything still looked like the future people imagined in the 50s. Bright chrome cars, smiling ads about atomic power, robots helping around the house. Nuclear energy became the big thing. Instead of moving towards smaller electronics and computers like we did, their world went all in on atomic technology. If something could run on nuclear power, it probably did. At the same time, though, the Cold War never really faded away. That fear of nuclear war stuck around way longer than it did in our timeline. And when the calendar finally reached 1991, the year the Cold War ended for us, it didn't play out the same here. The Soviet Union didn't collapse. It just kept going. Over the next few decades, the world kept changing, but the tension never really disappeared. Borders shifted, smaller wars happened here and there, and different countries started uniting together. One of the biggest examples of that was in Europe, where a lot of countries eventually formed something called the European Commonwealth. By the time we get around 2040, the global power balance had shifted too. The Soviet Union was still around, but it wasn't really the center of attention anymore. The main rivalry shaping the world was now between the United States and China. Those two were becoming the big powers everyone was watching. And the scary part was how common nuclear weapons had become. Back during the early Cold War days, only a few countries had them, but by this point, a lot more nations had figured it out. Even places that people wouldn't normally expect, like Cuba, had nuclear weapons. The result was a world where way more governments had the ability to start a nuclear war. Then, literally out of nowhere, a resource crisis hit. Oil is running out. Not completely gone yet, but enough that countries are starting to panic. Europe gets hit first, and probably the hardest. Factories slow down, fuel prices spike, and a lot of governments start realizing just how dependent they are on something that's suddenly disappearing. And oil isn't just another resource. At this point, it's basically the backbone of modern civilization. Transportation, industry, plastics, military equipment. A huge amount of the world still depends on it. Nuclear power helped in some areas, but it couldn't replace everything. The shortages spread fast. It's not just Europe dealing with this either. Entire economies start tightening up as governments scramble to secure whatever resources they can still get their hands on. Then, things get even worse. In 2053, the United Nations collapses. Countries stop pretending they're going to work together to solve the crisis. The Middle East still has some of the largest remaining oil reserves on the planet, and Europe is running out of options. So the European Commonwealth decides to take it by force. Operation Black Gold starts with the European Commonwealth Navy taking control of the Eastern Mediterranean almost immediately. The Israeli, Egyptian, and Lebanese navies try to respond, but they're completely outmatched. And within hours, most of them are either destroyed or forced back into their ports. With the sea basically cleared, the EC can start the real operation. From Cyprus, they launch multiple landings across the coasts of Israel and Lebanon. Most of the targets are ports and coastal cities, and it all happens in the middle of the night to catch defenders off guard. Troops start pouring onto the beaches in several places all at once. Lebanon folds pretty quickly under the pressure, but Israel holds out and puts up a much stronger defense. Fighting drags on while European troops keep pushing inland. At the same time, countries like Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia begin rushing troops toward the front, trying to stop the advance before it spreads further. It's already too late, though. European forces keep moving through the Levant and start pushing north towards Syria. The final landing of Operation Black Gold happens about 40 hours after the first landing. EC forces move on the Suez Canal. Once the canal falls, hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern troops end up trapped on the Sinai, leaving the region in a massive encirclement. Then something happens that nobody really sees coming. A nuclear weapon goes off in Tel Aviv. At first, there's confusion everywhere. The European Commonwealth doesn't immediately respond, and for a while nobody even knows who launched it. In the following days, investigators start piecing things together, and the story that comes out is even stranger. The explosion wasn't ordered by a government. It appears to have been a terrorist attack, carried out using one of the nuclear weapons stored in the city. To this day, no one really knows who was behind it, or whether it was one person or an organized group, the blast kills hundreds of thousands of civilians almost instantly. The shock spreads far beyond the Middle East. Back in Europe, public support for the war collapses almost overnight. A lot of people now just want the whole thing to end before it gets even worse. But on the front lines, the opposite is happening. Iran joins the war against the European Commonwealth, and slowly the momentum starts shifting. European forces that had been pushing across the Levant begin getting pushed back. The real turning point comes when Middle Eastern forces manage to retake the Suez Canal, reopening the route and breaking the massive encirclement that had trapped their armies earlier in the war. Days of fighting had already slowed things down, and now the EC was losing ground. That ends up being the breaking point. Instead of pulling out, the European Commonwealth escalates everything. Nuclear weapons start hitting cities across the Middle East. Tens of millions of people are killed, most of them civilians. Even Mecca is struck during the exchange, something that shocks the entire world. European leaders justify the strikes by pointing back to the Tel Aviv attack, claiming the countries they're fighting either supported it or allowed it to happen. Within hours, several Middle Eastern nations respond with their own launches. Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt all fire nuclear weapons toward Europe. European missile defenses manage to intercept a lot of them, but not all. Several warheads still make it through. Cities across Europe are hit, from Athens all the way to London. By the time the exchange finally stops, both regions are heavily damaged, and millions are dead. The war drags on for a few more weeks, but by that point, everyone involved is exhausted and dealing with the aftermath. Eventually, the fighting ends. The European Commonwealth holds on to some territory in the Middle East, but nowhere near enough to solve the oil crisis that started the whole conflict in the first place. The damage to Europe was devastating, to say the least. Over the next few years, radiation spreads across large parts of Western Europe. Wind patterns carry fallout across the region. Most of Western Europe becomes literally uninhabitable. Several countries start backing away from the European Commonwealth. The biggest break comes when the United Kingdom decides to leave entirely, signaling that the alliance that once dominated Europe has fell apart. But honestly, that whole European disaster, that's not even the main story. It's more like the appetizer for what's about to happen next. China was growing at a ridiculous pace. They started expanding outward in ways that made the rest of the world really nervous. First was Mongolia. China just marched in with a massive force, something like 1 million troops, and annexed the country. Then things got worse. Instead of invading, China approached Vietnam and Laos with a diplomatic offer to join China outright. And somehow, it worked. All of this helped China deal with the growing fuel shortage. More land, more resources, more control. At the same time, propaganda inside China went into overdrive. It had always existed, but now it was everywhere. Posters, broadcasts, news, speeches. For the billions of people living there, it was almost impossible to avoid. And nearly all of it pointed the same direction, right at the United States. But the United States wasn't exactly sitting still either. For decades, America had been on what people called a golden age. The economy was booming, technology was advancing, and life was pretty comfortable for a lot of people. At least until the oil crisis hit. Once fuel started disappearing, things changed quickly. The US turned toward Mexico and started putting heavy diplomatic pressure on them. The message was pretty blunt: hand over your oil. Mexico refused. Not long after that, American troops crossed the border. Officially, the explanation was regional instability, but nobody really bought that. Everyone knew the invasion was about oil. Mexico didn't stand much of a chance against the US military. The war was short and extremely one-sided. Mexico actually had nuclear weapons at the time, which made people incredibly nervous, but they never used them. Once the US secured the oil fields, fuel prices back on the mainland finally started dropping again. It felt like a huge improvement. Okay, let's back up for a moment. The world is undergoing the worst resource crisis in history, and it's leading to a depression. It already caused a war that costed over 100 million people to die. Multiple governments all over the world have collapsed because of it, and the two main superpowers, China and America, were expanding aggressively, desperate to not collapse. The world of Fallout is really scary when you look at the pre-apocalypse. It was clear where things were headed. War was coming, and China was going to make the first move. Alaska was the target, packed with oil that could change the game for them entirely. They called it Operation Armageddon, and the name wasn't an exaggeration. Top officials decided it was either they win or everyone dies. Massive numbers of specialized winter and mountain troops were sent across the Bering Strait to begin the invasion. The Soviet Union looked the other way, not wanting to get pulled in, but to be fair, they let China move through their land to stage the attack. No one wanted to speak openly about it, but everyone knew exactly what was happening, and the tension was already thick. Back in the United States, they hadn't fully invaded Canada, but key areas were occupied to secure supply lines to Alaska. The government knew a war was inevitable. Years earlier, American military scientists had created early prototypes of a new type of weapon called power armor. Over time, funding and investment skyrocketed, and two models emerged as the favorites: the T-45 and the T-51. They were hard to understand, but they were also far more advanced than anything China expected. Then, in the winter of 2066, Operation Armageddon began, and World War III officially erupted. Chinese forces poured into southern and western Alaska, fighting the Battle of Anchorage in temperatures far below zero. Up to 900,000 specialized troops were on the move, gaining ground by the hour, while back on the mainland, U.S. alert levels jumped from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3. The entire military focused on two priorities: getting reinforcements to Alaska and preparing to launch nuclear weapons if necessary. Power armored divisions were sent north from California, technically built for any climate, but the extreme cold would be a brutal test. And while they slowly made their way to the front, American forces did everything they could to hold the line against the Chinese advance. Meanwhile, America would complete Project Pipeline. The project's end goal was to annex Canada. Since the start of the war, the project had begun, and by 2072, it was done. The last thing to do was easily move into Canada with no resistance. Millions of American troops went across the border up into Canada, and after a brief period of Canada being occupied, it would be annexed into the U.S. The amount of oil America just gained was outrageous. It was a very big shift in the war. In Alaska, the second and main Battle of Anchorage went differently than the first. This time, the Americans struck back, leading with a full T-51 division. The power armor gave them the edge, and Chinese forces started being pushed back, squeezed out of southern Alaska, almost as fast as they had arrived. It looked like the U.S. had regained control of the state. Alaska wasn't the only place the war was raging. Across Asia, countries were joining in the war too. Japan, Taiwan, and the Koreas threw themselves into the conflict, and at first it looked chaotic. North Korea invaded South Korea, only to have South Korea push back, marching north through the peninsula and even crossing into China with Allied support. Landings along the Chinese coast hit massive cities like Hong Kong and Shanghai, while the advance in Manchuria kept grinding forward. China threw millions of troops at every front, but technological superiority from the Western allies made each counterattack devastating. Slowly, painstakingly, the march toward Beijing began. Every few meters of ground cost dozens of soldiers. China was on the edge of collapsing. The world had been heading here for years, but now there was no denying it. Nuclear Armageddon. Ground battles had already cost millions. The nuclear war earlier with the European Commonwealth and the Middle East costed over 100 million lives alone, but nothing compared to what was about to come. The U.S. Pacific Fleet suddenly reported 3 unidentified objects off the coast of California, while the USAF detected a squadron of Chinese aircraft near Alaska. China had reached its breaking point. If they couldn't win, the world would have to pay. On October 3, 2077 at 9:13 a.m., the United States went into DEFCON 2 after 4 nuclear launches were detected from China. By 9:17 a.m., those launches were confirmed, and the U.S. escalated to DEFCON 1, full-scale nuclear war. The first missile hit San Francisco. Chicago, New York, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, Seattle, Detroit, and any other big city. Submarines lurking off the west coast and aircraft approaching from the north launched additional warheads. spreading devastation across the country. South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan were also struck by a few nukes. The United States retaliated immediately, launching their own nuclear arsenal at Beijing, Wuhan, Hanoi, and other key locations. Troops on the front all deserted within minutes. Literally everyone. They knew their fate was soon, and they just didn't care anymore. Governments around the world began to fade into nothingness as the radiation spread across the earth. Within only an hour, the world was dead. The governments of China and the United States were gone. Black clouds rolled over the atmosphere. If I did the math correctly, 1,016,666 people died per second during the Great War. That's 61,360,660 a minute. The Great War was finished. Every country and every person that wasn't in a bunker was dead. Fallout lore does continue, of course, but the objective of this video was to just cover everything before the post-apocalypse. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing. Either way, thank you for watching the video.